Hi, everybody. I am Laura Hoyer, and I'll answer the other questions too. I'm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where it's 11 a.m. and it is rainy today, but I can't complain. The last 2 days have been like in the 60s for the first time in a while. So it's all in balance, I guess. Okay, so I will share my screen so that way you guys can see what I'm looking at. But and I'm so thankful. Thank you, William and Tara, for organizing this, because what we're going to talk about today are some of the top questions I get as a certified professional resume writer and a certified professional career coach. I personally myself was a teacher. I taught middle school English. I taught 6th and 7th grade specifically. People usually go, wow, when I say that, because it's like, that's a really interesting group of kids. But since I left teaching, I've been in the instructional design space. I've been in corporate, I've been in higher ed, I've been at startups, I've been at jumbo companies. So all of the information that I'm sharing here are helpful tips to help you potentially get your first instructional design position and how to talk about that in your resume. So first, just a really quick agenda. I wasn't trying to jam pack this, because I know that people will have questions at the end. So I wanted to make sure I left time for that. But basically what we're going to cover today are resume basics, especially when it comes to instructional design, how to talk about newly learned skills, and then tips for your portfolio. Because while the title of this is Resume 101, your portfolio, especially when it comes to instructional design, is pretty much part of your job application materials. And it's very important we talk about that as well. Also, if I'm talking too fast, please let me know. I do have a tendency to talk quickly. All right, so first, I think it's very important to be very clear that unless you held a job title that was instructional designer, you cannot use instructional designer as a job title in your headline or on LinkedIn or in your resume for a lot of reasons. But you can modify your title. If you don't want to say teacher, you could say educator. And depending on your role, you may also include things like curriculum developer or team lead or department chair, as long as you actually held those titles. You can't call yourself department chair if you were never department chair. I like to say, imagine a call test. If somebody who wants to hire you calls your current employer or past employer and says, hey, I want to hear more about your name, the instructional designer, if the person on the other end of the line will either laugh or say, I have no idea what the heck you're talking about, please don't include it. So you can, however, write things like experience with using instructional design principles, because that's true, or uses instructional design to create engaging learning. Those statements are true. Calling yourself an instructional designer, if that was not your title, is not true. If you have questions about this, I'm happy to answer them at the end as well. But one of the key things here is a lot of people feel like they can't use their current title, especially if it is teacher, because they feel that it's frowned upon for some reason. But instead of looking at it from that point of view, I instead want you to look at it as a fact. It's simply a fact. It's part of your story. That was your title. What matters more to the hiring team is what you did as part of that role and how that relates to the role you're applying for. Your title could have been chief cheerleader, and as long as your accomplishments describe the skills and accomplishments and results that are related to the job that you want, it won't really matter what your title was. So I want to say that first, because that is a very common misconception. So I want to clear the air about that before we dive into writing your accomplishments. I'm going to take a sip of water really quick. Okay, so now let's talk about writing your accomplishments. There are a couple key things here. I mean, I'm going to talk a bunch about accomplishments in a second, so don't think that this is everything, but it's very important before you start writing anything that you are crystal clear on what job or job function you're looking for, because it makes it a million times easier to figure out what hiring managers are looking for in the resume. Because you'll notice as you look at, for example, instructional design positions, a lot of them are looking for the same exact thing. It's just worded slightly differently. So you know that in your resume, you need to talk about those things. I also say job function because, and if you may have noticed, if you've been poking around on LinkedIn or looking at job postings, there are similar job titles. So instructional designer, very similar job description as, for example, an e-learning developer. There are some minor key differences, but the job descriptions themselves can be very similar. So that's why I say job function in addition to job title. All right, so number one thing to keep in mind, every single accomplishment, and by accomplishment, I mean the bullet points in your resume, every single thing should be there for a very specific reason. You should be able to point to every single piece on your resume and say, this is here because it shows this skill. Excuse me. And again, look at multiple job descriptions to help guide you to know which skills you need to include. You should also include relevant, impactful data when it makes sense. So think of it this way. Corporate, especially, whether you're higher ed or not, always wants to know, was it worth the time and money and effort we put into something to get some results back? So for example, is it worth us paying for an instructional designer, let's say, I don't know, $1 million a year, just if that's not what we make, but is it worth paying $1 million a year for an instructional designer to get us these results? So you want to articulate to them what results you have achieved in the past with the skills related to the job. So I also often quote Mean Girls when I talk about this, because there's a line in Mean Girls when she says she likes math because it's the same in every language. It's the same with results. Results are understood by everybody in every industry, no matter what you're talking about. If you say that you increased something by 35%, everybody understands that you had a result tied to what you were looking to do. So the results of your actions always make sense, but sometimes, depending on the accomplishment, the number of learners, the number of teams, the number of weeks may not be necessary depending on the bullet point. Other times they may be necessary. And I share this because let's say you're writing multiple bullet points for your current position. You don't need to include the number of learners for every single bullet point unless it varies. So if you're teaching 100 kids, you don't need to say 100 students, 100 learners, 100 participants in every single bullet point. So always ask yourself, what is the point of including this? What would the reader get out of it? Okay, and then the other important thing that we have to talk about are hard skills versus soft skills. So in the job description, there are definitely hard skills that are required to be an instructional designer. You may have noticed that they're looking for things like Articulate 360 experience or experience with Adobe Captivate or Camtasia. Those are hard skills. The soft skills associated with instructional design are also things like communicating and managing relationships with others, time management, teamwork, all of those kinds of things are soft skills. So consider including tools, not consider, I take that back, definitely include the tools you use in your accomplishment statements. So if you're talking about a specific project that you've done and you, of course, are including results, in the middle of that statement, be sure to include any tools that you use to accomplish that are also in the job description. So let's say you created a video lesson and it was super successful, you're super proud of it. You want to include what video recording tool, editing tools you used to accomplish that. Your hard skills, especially, shouldn't just live in a skills section. And we'll talk more about this in a minute because I know some people are already in their heads already like, well, I learned tools that I haven't used in my past positions. We're going to get there, don't worry. But if there are ones that you've used, for example, I'm sure you've used Microsoft Office tools. Make sure you include those in the statements where appropriate and where you, for example, you may have used Excel to manage large projects. That's still important to explain and include in your bullet points. Now, the soft skills like teamwork and problem solving, they don't need to be explicitly stated. You don't need to say using teamwork or using problem solving skills, but the reader should be able to tell by the way that you write your statement that you worked with a team to accomplish X, Y, and Z, or you identified a problem and developed a solution. Cool. So now we're going to get into the accomplishments formula, how to actually write your accomplishment. So I recommend starting with an active verb, and my English teacher friends out there know exactly what I mean by that. But you are talking about what you did in the accomplishment. So let's say you designed an entirely new curriculum with 10 people. Start with what you did and the active verb associated with that. So if you developed, for example, interactive activities, you start there, developed interactive activities in collaboration with 10 colleagues, let's say. So always start with what you did, make sure it's a powerful active verb. So a passive verb would be things like collaborated with, or that's the only one coming to mind right now, but taking ownership away from what you did. So the active verb is what specifically did I do, and make sure it's a strong one. Another pro tip specifically for instructional design are the words in ADDIE that somebody is looking for in your resume can be the active verb. For example, you can analyze things. You could talk about how you developed, talk about how you design things, talk about how you implemented something, talk about what you evaluated. That could be your active verb because those are the things that a hiring team is looking for as well. Now, the next piece is basically what you did, what tools you used, and who it impacted. So that seems like a lot of information. And like the example below, sometimes it's not necessary to include all of it, but always ask yourself if it's relevant before deciding to include it or skip it. And then at the end, you want to include the results of your actions. So in the example below, redesigned is the active verb. Then the customer onboarding training program for about 200 employees is the what you did. Notice there is no tool listed there, but it talks about who is impacted, 200 employees. But maybe the tools I used were a super long list, or they're not relevant, or they're listed in another bullet point. And then the end is the results, which is the most important piece here, because most companies understand that saving time also means saving money. All right, so now these are the important questions to ask yourself as you're working on your resume. And you may not have an answer to all of these things, but these can kind of help prompt some additional information that may be missing from your resume, or it may prompt you to think of something that you may not have already included. So companies care about money. So it's always important to ask yourself first, did it save money? And sometimes, like in the example I just showed you, the saving money can come from saving time. You may not have an exact figure, but you can say it also saved the company money or the organization money. You can also talk about accomplishments that made money, accomplishments that save time, and then very important, especially for instructional design, because that's part of what you're intending to do, is showing a change took place. Basically, because you were involved, something happened. Another question to ask yourself is over what period of time? So I was just working on a resume not that long ago where we talked about the length of the school year. So she talked about 36 weeks, which can be impressive, but if you're talking about over 36 weeks for every single bullet point, it's not necessarily necessary. And a lot of people giving your title and things will assume that things took place over the course of an entire school year. Now, if you developed something extremely quickly or accomplished amazing results in a short amount of time, that would be important information to include because, like I said, the reader automatically assumes over the course of a school year. You also want to ask yourself, does this accomplishment demonstrate something directly related to the job I'm applying for? This can be kind of hard because especially my teacher friends on the call can understand this. You've accomplished a ton of stuff that you're very proud of. But if it's not directly related to the job that you're applying for, it doesn't necessarily need to be included, especially because your resume is full of valuable real estate. You want to make sure that every single thing on there, again, relates directly to the job. Also ask yourself, what skill or skills does this accomplishment show the reader? And a bonus, like another question to that is that, are those skills clearly stated in this accomplishment? And then what tools did you use to accomplish it? And always ask yourself, so what? So why am I including it? Why does the reader care? And this isn't to be mean. I'm not saying this to attack you or anything, but just keep in mind that if somebody is spending their time reading this, you want to make sure that every single thing that they read makes them want to call you. All right, now we're going to jump into the next part of this, which is, what about new skills I've learned? So we've talked about how to talk about accomplishments in your past positions. And I know a lot of you are here because you've been upskilling and learning new things that you maybe haven't done in past positions. So now, depending on where or how you learn the skills, for example, if you're currently in an Eduflow course, that is a place that you can include information about skills that you've learned in your education section, because it is educating you on the field and important skills relevant to the job. In some situations, it can be listed as a volunteer experience in your volunteer experience section. You may not already have one, but you may need to add one. But either way, in that section, you don't just want to list tools that you've learned, and you don't necessarily want to just list the fact that, like, I designed stuff or I practiced instructional design skills. You need to be specific, just like your other accomplishment bullet points. Talk about specific methods you learned, tools you learned, who it was designed for if you designed something, and why, if applicable. So for example, if as part of a course that you've done or an academy, you developed let's say a storyline for a specific audience, you would want to talk about, for example, in the statement at the bottom, learn to use the ADDIE and backwards design models to design interactive e-learning using Articulate Storyline and Adobe Captivate for a learner avatar to meet instructional objectives. Excuse me. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, especially when it comes to your portfolio, but the hiring manager wants to know that you understand the why behind your decisions. So for example, if you went through a course and they gave you a learner avatar and said, hey, they need to learn X, Y, and Z, that's important information that the hiring team needs to know. Whereas if you designed something just to design something, that's not necessarily relevant, but you do still want to be able to talk about who it was designed for and why you chose those tools. And I'll reiterate that again in a second. But no matter what, newly learned skills must be included in your portfolio. Especially teachers on this call, you have been to training where somebody put together a PowerPoint and called it training, and it put everybody in the room to sleep. The difference between an instructional designer and somebody who put together the kind of training I just described is the instructional designer understands the learner and the what and the why and the decisions that they made in order to get the audience to learn what they need them to learn, versus just putting together a PowerPoint and speaking at a group. So hiring managers, and I can't say every single hiring manager in the whole wide world because I don't know for sure, but I can venture to say most would rather know how you're applying what you've learned than just listing it as a skill on your resume. For example, I could put on my resume that I juggle, but I actually can't. So make sure that whether it's in your resume, like the example below, or in your portfolio, you are showing how you've applied those skills. Cool. Now, portfolios. Hiring managers, again, want you to understand that the instructional choice, I take that back. Hiring managers want to know that you understand the instructional choices you made in your projects, in addition to knowing the tools. A lot of people I've talked to, especially as they learn all of the tools related to instructional design, feel like they just need a storyline example. They need a RISE course. They need a video of anything. which in a way you can create a lot of different things for a lot of different reasons. But no matter what, whether it's in your resume or your portfolio, you need to be able to talk about it in an interview. And the number one question that's going to come up in your interview is, why did you make this choice? Why did you do that? Tell me a little bit about your design process. And you need to be able to explain that. So if you choose to, let's say, create a video course on how to make the perfect latte, great. You need to be able to explain why you chose a video, why you chose how to make a latte, who the audience was, all of those things. You also need to include the link to your portfolio on your resume, on your LinkedIn. Feel free to share it when you're networking. Excuse me. And then also vice versa, in your portfolio, you want to make sure to link to your LinkedIn profile and include either a link to your resume or an example of your resume on your portfolio. Make it easy for the viewer to get additional information about you and how to contact you. I also highly recommend writing out the URL and hyperlinking it so that if it's a hyperlink and it works and somebody can click on it, great. But if they can't, they also have the URL that they can type in themselves and get this to the same place. Include a short blurb, excuse me, meaning like a little writing piece or a video to explain the why behind your decisions for just about everything on your portfolio. Now, you don't need to write a novel, you don't need to record a 10-minute long video, but you need to be able to explain it no matter what. One tool that I really like is Loom, and you can use it for free. And the best part about using it for free is you're limited to 5-minute clips. So it automatically limits you to create a short video. So use that to your advantage. It also kind of works the way that you're viewing me right now, where you could see me, but you can also see my screen. So you can walk somebody through it, and it adds a little bit of personalization to it. And it answers their question about whether you understand the choices behind what you've designed. Also consider including planning documents that show your thought process behind what you created. So that's your needs analysis, your project management plans, storyboards, etc. And again, I should tattoo this everywhere, like be able to explain why. Make sure you can explain why you chose the tool you used, why you chose the activity that you included. Why is it a drag and drop and not a short answer? Why is it a short answer and not a multiple choice? Those kinds of things. Also be able to explain why you chose that length of time for learning. So for example, why a 30-minute lesson over a 5-minute video? Include examples you're proud of. This seems like it goes without saying, but I viewed a lot of portfolios where people just threw together an example of a storyline course because they felt like they needed an example and they aren't necessarily proud of it. Your portfolio should be the best samples of the kind of work that you can do. That being said, you don't have to solely include the tools that are listed on a job description. If you find a cool tool that relates to a project you're working on or an idea you have or a kind of training that you see being helpful somewhere, and you can understand why it would make sense using that kind of tool, but it isn't necessarily known or well known. For example, 7-Taps isn't usually listed on a job description, but it's a really interesting and cool way to show your design skills. So include examples you're proud of, including examples that may use tools that aren't listed on job descriptions. Also, this is very important, especially for my teacher friends that are on the call. Do not feel pressured to create all entirely new pieces for your portfolio. The whole point of the portfolio is showing what you've done over your career. So there's more value in talking about projects that have been implemented and evaluated and you've actually done it from end to end over just designing something that will never be implemented or evaluated. And by that, I mean the video example I talked about earlier about how to make a latte is great. It's a great example of you using video, editing, all of those things. But if you don't actually plan on sending it to anybody or evaluating if it was successful, then there's only so much a hiring manager can gauge from that example. Versus, even if you taught kindergarten, let's say you taught a lesson on the planets to kindergartners, Being able to explain the why behind all of your instructional decisions, how it was implemented, how it was received, how the evaluation went, and changes you've made because of the evaluation is much more impactful than a brand new example that, like I said, will never be implemented. All right, so if you take nothing else from this, please take away that every single accomplishment in your resume and every single item in your portfolio should be there for a very clear reason. And like I said, I did want to leave a lot of time for questions because I know that there are some. So I will stop sharing my screen and we can get started. As I take a big sip of water.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Laura. This has been so helpful. We've had a few questions. Maybe I'll get sort of the small questions out of the way quick, and then we can jump into some bigger concepts. Someone was talking about when you mentioned don't include instructional designer in your, in your resume if you weren't specifically an instructional designer. Someone asked a little bit about, what if you have instructional design experience, but your title doesn't match and you want to include instructional designer in a LinkedIn headline? And that also kind of gets into how LinkedIn plays to resumes. So if you want to speak to that, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'll start with the LinkedIn piece. In your headline on LinkedIn, you can put instructional design. You can write experienced instructional design. You can write experienced in instructional design principles, using instructional design principles to accomplish X, Y, and Z. That's totally fine. And it also depends on what your title was. So my statement about do not use instructional designer if that was not your title. If your title was like e-learning developer, or excuse me, if it was like learning specialist, but you were doing instructional design, I would not change the title itself on your resume, but you can say that you have instructional design experience, or you could say instructional designer, depending on what the job title was. So to the person who asked that question, if you want to get specific about your specific situation, please feel free to message me on LinkedIn and we can walk through it all. But yes, on your LinkedIn, in your headline, because I know that everybody wants to make sure they're using the right keywords, you can put instructional design. Absolutely. You could say your experienced instructional design, all of those kinds of things, but please do not use instructional designer if that was not your title.
Awesome. Thank you. Karen also mentioned in the chat, what if your official title was contractor, but you worked in an e-learning developer role?
Aha, great question. So for your resume, or even on your LinkedIn profile, I would write instructional, or what was the title?
Contractor.
What was the
and then
e-learning developer?
E-learning developer. Yep.
Yeah. So you'll put e-learning developer and then put that it was a contract position. So you could do like e-learning developer dash contract or something like that. But yes, that was what you were working on. That would be a title if you were working there full time. That's totally fine. And you could just put that it was a contract position.
Amazing. Thank you. Another quick question was about a summary section on the top of the resume and what your recommendations are with that.
There's so much, a lot of information about this out there. But basically your summary section is there to bridge the gap for the reader. So let's say your past experience, and I know not everybody on this call might be teachers, but a majority of the people on this call are probably teachers. Let's say your experience has only been in education. You want to make sure that it's clear to the reader what you bring to the table as an instructional designer. So that summary section is prime real estate because it's in the first third of your resume. It's one of the first things the reader is going to read about you, where you need to use that to show that you have the key skills that they're looking for and what your areas of expertise are, what kind of big accomplishments you've had, so that way they're enticed to keep reading. And the words you use, the sentences you write will vary from person to person, but the basic premise of the summary is to bridge that gap for the reader.
And on titles, Ian's asking in the chat, what is the recommendation if you had multiple titles, like maybe you had some promotions? Would you recommend just putting the title you had when you left or including everything?
So that's a great question too. And it's kind of hard to explain without demonstrating it, but I hope I can explain this well. So in your resume, I would put the title of the company or the organization, and then like the location on the far right side. Then underneath it, I would put the job title itself and the dates that you held that specific job title. And then underneath that job title, what you accomplished specifically within that job title, and then the next job title, and so on and so forth. But it should be in reverse chronological order. So the one at the top, right by the name of the company, should be your current position or the most recent position, and then work backwards from there. So that way the reader can see, even if you've held 3-4 positions, that you've moved up, you've learned new things, you're accomplishing things in each position as you go, instead of lumping them all together and being like, yeah, while I was there, I did a bunch of different things. Make it very clear to them what you did in each role.
Excellent. Super helpful. I have 2 more like quick questions from our chat, and then we have some other bigger questions. And then if anyone else has questions that they've been kind of marinating on, feel free to include those in the chat and we'll get to them as well. Next quick question. How should the summary on a resume differ from like a LinkedIn summary?
Okay.
Can you just use like the same thing?
Great question. When all else fails, you can use the same summary. That's totally fine. But if you have an impactful story, if you have a special experience that you want to share, you can use that about section to tell a little bit more about yourself, your personality, your style, and those kinds of things. But you still want to highlight your key skills no matter what. And you can always add at the end of your about section, what I like to call areas of expertise, where that's where you would list a couple of keywords. So you could say area, proven expertise in, and then list like 3 to 5 key areas that you do have experience in and that they'll also see in your resume. But if you're the kind of person where you're like, I don't necessarily have like a story to tell, I'm not feeling that creative, all of that kind of stuff, then using your summary is totally fine. But if you choose to write out a more in-depth, show your personality kind of about section, keep in mind that the reader only sees the first few lines before they need to click like see more or something like that. So you need to make it compelling in order for them to continue reading.
That's such a great point. You could even like look at your LinkedIn from like an incognito window or something else, pardon me.
Yes.
And to see where that see more button happens so that you can really maximize that stuff that's already going to pop up. One other quick question also related to LinkedIn. There was a question about what's the best way to add your portfolio onto your resume and in LinkedIn, if there's any specific ways to include that.
Yeah. So with your portfolio, I recommend for your resume, including it with your contact information. So like if you're picturing your resume, it should be your name, and then underneath it, basically how to get in contact with you. Somewhere in there should be the URL for your portfolio. LinkedIn, there are a couple places that you can put it, and you can put it in all of the places. That's totally fine. But there is a space underneath your name. I think I can actually pull it up so I can show you what I mean, because it gets a little complicated to describe without being able to see it. Okay, let me share. Okay. So on your profile on LinkedIn, there is a little space right here where you can add a link. You would hit the edit button here and scroll down to website. And you can add the link to your website and then the link text where you can say like, check out my portfolio or instructional design examples here, something like that to grab somebody's attention. That's one spot. And another spot is in this featured section where you would create a post and share your portfolio, but then you can go to edit here and then you would add one of your posts to a featured one, and you can drag them around to make it the first one that somebody sees. And another place that you could put it depending on your current position or job titles and things, it may make sense to link it as part of one of your most recent experiences or as like a volunteer experience. If you have one of those sections, I got that here. In volunteering, you can add a link to anything really, and that could be your portfolio. But no matter what, you want to be able to explain in next to the link or around it that this is where they would go to access your portfolio and see examples of your work.
Thank you. Awesome. The visual to see it on LinkedIn is super helpful.
I know. I was like, I can't just say there's a different spot and there's a button. Yeah.
You just go to settings. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on a 2-page resume?
My opinion is it doesn't matter as long as whatever length your resume is, one, that it's full of relevant information, because that's what the reader cares about. Fun fact, my dad just asked me to look over his resume, and he hasn't job searched in a million years, and his resume is 3 going on 4 pages, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, but I told him that, like, if it's going to be 3 pages, you got to fill the 3 pages. If it's going to be 4 pages, you got to fill the 4 pages. I know CVs also get very, very long. So the length doesn't necessarily matter as long as you are using it to clearly articulate all of your skills. That being said, usually if you're early in your career, it's harder to fill full 2 pages. So if you get to a point where you're like a page and a half in and you just have nothing else to add, consider removing some things. And also remember, on LinkedIn, you can list more things under each position than you can in your resume. So if there are bullet points in your resume that you're considering pulling out just because you're running out of space, you want to maximize what you're doing, you can include them in LinkedIn as well. But always keep in mind that, like, you can play around with font sizes, margins, things like that to get things to fit a little bit better. But if you are going to a second page, totally fine. It doesn't bother me at all as long as you use that second page.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jasper had a great question about specifically when you're in a resume and you've worked on a team before, how is it best to state an accomplishment that was done as part of a team? Should you like specify your roles or specific projects or anything like that?
So this sounds like it might be specific to the person asking the question. So if this answer doesn't answer your specific question, again, please message me. I'm happy to walk through it. But I typically recommend starting with, what did you do in the project? And then talking about what the project was designed or the team was assembled to accomplish, or what the purpose of the team was. And then the accomplishments of the whole team's efforts together. But if it's a huge project, if it involves a million different parts, if you can't succinctly talk about that in one bullet point, then it may be necessary to break it up into like how you interacted with different parts of the team to accomplish different things. But just keep in mind, no matter what, the hiring manager wants to know, what did you do, even if you were on a team.
Excellent. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Jose had a great question earlier about what would you recommend for someone who's just starting out? They don't really have any measurable accomplishments to put on their CV. What would you recommend for their resume specifically?
So first, I would recommend start gathering data right now. There's data on everything. I have a list of like questions you can ask yourself to find data points, but data doesn't always mean you improved something by 10%. It can also mean that you, for example, how many people are on this call? A bunch. I don't know. Let's say 100. I spoke to 100 people. That's still data. That's information. It gives context to the reader, because speaking to 100 people is very different than speaking to 3. It's very different than speaking to 1,000, but it gives the reader a frame of mind around what went on. Now, when talking about results, and again, teacher friends on this call, you know that some things are extremely hard to measure. For example, engagement in a lesson. You can sense and you can tell that there's increased engagement. There are more people asking questions. They're really into it, but you can't necessarily measure on the spot. This is 67% more raised hands than yesterday. But you can state that it increased engagement, or you can state that students were more engaged in the lesson and had more questions or something like that. So there are ways that you can include it that's still factual, but I always recommend trying to gather as much data as possible because, again, it gives context, and that's what the reader wants ultimately to know about your efforts and what you did. What were the results?
Similarly, for new people, especially just graduating people, is it okay to include projects that we did as part of coursework in grad school?
Yes. Yeah. So your resume would look slightly different, but kind of like the example I shared where underneath education and underneath the description of what you were enrolled in or what you completed, there was a bullet point underneath it that kind of summarized what you learned. So that's the kind of formatting I would recommend for example, like a graduate degree program, talking about the courses you're taking or projects you were involved in. And then if you can, and hopefully you can, including the results there.
Awesome.
Or, sorry, I didn't interrupt. If you are working on it right now and you do not know what the results are because it's not over yet and it's not done, you can talk about intended results. And this is true for anybody, whether they're a new grad or not. If you're in the middle of a project and you're like, okay, the goal is to increase X, Y, and Z or improve something, you can talk about that. And if you have a date, you could say like to be implemented in fall 2024 or anything like that. That's all helpful information instead of just saying that you researched something.
Amazing. Excellent. Then, so say, you have a role that you've completed at a company or for a client. What's the best way to incorporate that work, keeping in mind things like privacy, security requirements, that kind of thing?
Do you mean like kind of like IP stuff, intellectual property, where like you can't necessarily share that thing that you created because it's owned by the company?
Yeah. And Adina had this question. So Adina, if you have any specific comments, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute you if you'd like to share more details. I think that this question came when we were talking about portfolios a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So like sharing a project in a portfolio,
Yeah.
or sharing data that might be something that the company would prefer if you didn't include that data on your resume.
So I'll talk about in your portfolio first. In the portfolio, you can include pieces of projects and recreate something. So for example, if you did let's say an hour-long rise and storyline combined kind of learning thing for this company, but you can't really use any of that. But within there was an interaction that you created that you're super proud of and is a great example of your work. Recreate the activity using a different topic. So if the topic was something like super healthcare specific, maybe you do something that's more related to your hobbies, like running or something like that. But in your portfolio, in your video or in your blurb or whatever, you would explain that that activity was part of a larger project that is protected by IP. So this is an example, a recreation of that activity using a different topic. And you could talk more about like, we chose specifically storyline because it was more engaging than X, Y, and Z. That information is still relevant, but you wouldn't necessarily be talking about stuff that's protected. Now on your resume, it's a little bit different. So if you have specific questions, let me know. But you can usually remove company names, specific items, but you could still talk about like tools that you've used and accomplishments in general. But depending on what you're trying to show, what skills you're trying to show, what results you're trying to articulate, it depends kind of person to person. So happy to talk through it if you need more info.
Thanks, Laura. Speaking of portfolios, would you recommend on a portfolio that people include like a short demo or a flagship project that kind of goes through the entire course that they designed?
What a great question.
Yeah.
I was actually talking to Steve Corney, if any of you guys are familiar with him. I was talking to him about this 2 days ago now. Think about it this way. The hiring team will not have hours to sit through an entire program. They just won't. They want to know that you understand what you created and why, and not just did something to check off a box. So in that case, I would say shorter is better. But even if it's part of a much larger project, you want to articulate it's part of a larger project. And this is the key component that I want to show you. This is the specific reason why we included this piece, so on and so forth. And in interviews and things, if you talk about it and say, hey, I have this whole project I can share, that's totally fine. But I think in your portfolio, it makes more sense to talk about specific pieces of the project for specific purposes and mention that as part of a larger project, should they want to take a look at the entire thing, which chances are they probably don't. Not because they don't actually want to see it, but because they don't have the time.
Awesome. Shifting back to the resume. Steve had a really great question. He says, my day job, i.e. bread and butter, has nothing to do with ID. My side gig is designing courses that I teach and am the SME in a relatively niche industry. And I'm trying to imagine what the best relationship between these would be and how to display them in a resume.
That's great.
Yeah.
I would make your side hustle project a separate experience, just like a regular job. If you're not getting paid for it, though, I would put it in a volunteer experience section, but it needs to be there no matter what, especially if your other positions aren't necessarily directly related to what you want to do. But yes, it should be a separate position, and you should list out the specifics around what you do. It doesn't really matter if the bullet points there, if you have more bullet points than you do for your current job. That's really fine because the reader wants to know what you're doing that's relevant. And if what you're doing on the side is more relevant than your day job, then at least they have the information they need.
Excellent. We have a couple more questions. I'm going to focus these questions on resumes. And then there's a bunch of questions about portfolios. And so we're going to save those for if we have some more time at the end. I do love, though, and appreciate that you've been answering these just like rapid fire, like what great information all just bundled into a bunch of time. So thank you.
Yeah.
Adina asked about some examples of results or impact statements instructional designers can emphasize, even like specific bullet points that could be really impactful and impressive in a resume.
I put together a whole list that's on my LinkedIn profile. I don't know if it's saved as a featured post. I thought it was, but maybe it's not. Either way, I'll resurface it where I had probably 20 plus questions about different ways that you can look at your experience to gain data points, references, to spark some additional ideas. But basically, you want to go through a job posting. And if they're looking for a specific skill, so for example, an instructional design job posting, somewhere on it will probably mention a needs analysis. So you want to rack your brain and think about what examples do I have of times where I took a deep dive into what people actually need to know and created something because of that. So on and so forth. Like if you're going to see stuff about the entire ADDIE process, so you're going to see things about designing things, you're going to see things about implementing stuff, you're going to see requirements for evaluating things. So that's the kind of information you're racking your brain for, because that's the basic component of the role. That's like 90% of instructional design right there. But there are also things like project management and other things that you can include. But if you're struggling with that piece, again, send me a message, happy to help. And I will share my huge list again. Will or Tara, if you want to share it as well, you're more than welcome to. But there are tons of ways that you can look at your experience. And another key question to ask yourself, especially when it comes to instructional design, is when have I made an impact or changed somebody's behavior? Because that's what training is I'm imparting something, I'm asking you to do something to change your behavior. So that's another way that you can look at it, where sometimes changing behavior isn't teaching somebody how to capitalize and now they can capitalize correctly. Sometimes it's also shaping their actual behaviors. Like they're doing unsafe things in the classroom and now you need to shape it so that way it's a more safe environment, those kinds of things as well. And again, since instructional design mainly focuses on adults, think too about like how you've worked with adults, whether informally or formally, to change their behavior. Whether it's learning that new tool, and the people that are very close to retirement who really, really didn't want to learn it, and now they have a ton of questions and you help them. That's still part of changing behavior and imparting wisdom on somebody.
That's a huge one. I definitely had that on my resume.
Very
Yeah. Someone asked about using color on resumes, and I've seen a lot of resumes that are very, very heavy on design and different boxes and colors and different things. How do you feel about all that?
It's a debate. So
Yeah.
there's a debate in the instructional design world specifically around whether to use, let's say, a Canva resume or a traditional ATS resume. I will say that the ATS does not automatically reject candidates unless you answer a knockout question. So for example, a question like, are you willing to relocate? If you say no and the position's 6,000 miles away, it's going to automatically reject you. Any other time, a human is the one who takes a look at your resume and makes that decision. The ATS takes the information from your resume and makes it easy for them to flip through on the back end electronically, the hiring team and recruiters and everybody. So this is also why you're often asked to upload your resume and then enter every single thing from your resume in separately. So that way that information appears correctly. So ATS systems, since they try to do that, and the ones where they don't ask you to copy and paste everything, the ATS will attempt to do that. If your resume has multiple columns, if it has graphics and things, the ATS doesn't know what to do with that, and it just reads across this way. So the words can come through jumbled and not really make sense. That being said, a human will still look at it, and they will look at your resume. My resume right now is a design resume. It has like purples and blues and stuff in it, but my resume has worked well for me because it didn't go through an ATS, because it went directly to a hiring manager who was like, wow, this is great. So sometimes it makes more sense to do a very plain and boring resume and show your design skills in your portfolio. And another key thing that I talked to Steve about yesterday is, Tuesday, sometimes it's not necessarily about the design and the design skills. The design can be taught. The important piece is, will somebody learn from you? That's why you're being hired. So yes, it's a plus if everything looks beautiful, but it's not always required. So consider that as you're writing your resume. They'd rather know, like, get the key information versus look at something extremely beautiful.
Makes so much sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's one question about portfolios that I'm going to share, and then I think the other ones we're going to save. And so we'll keep this as our possibly last questions, then we have a little time to wrap up. This is about, so for teachers who want more practice with tools like Beyond and Articulate, but aren't employed at the business and, they don't have access to the product, what advice do you have for getting practice and building, lines on your resume and a portfolio even after the trials end?
What a great question. So two things. One is the experience piece. I always recommend volunteering. You can contact your favorite charity, your favorite nonprofit, and say, hey, do you need to train people? Do you need to train volunteers? Do you need to train staff members? I'm happy to do it for you for free, and just see what they say. A lot of nonprofits and charities will gladly take free help. And then you also get to practice working with other people and interfacing with a client. The other thing is things with free trials. So I know the big one is Storyline, and Storyline does take a while. Like, I've used Storyline for years, but it's still not the fastest development tool. So I always recommend doing storyboarding and things before you sign up for a trial. So know exactly what you want to use it for and what the plan is. So that way, when you hit sign up and you sit go, it is pedal to the metal and you are getting the most out of your free trial. If you are volunteering, and let's say you really, really, really want to use Storyline, which again is not always necessary, but you really want to use it and it makes sense with the project, you can ask the organization if there's a way that they can either split the cost with you, or if they can pay for it and other teams can use it, so on and so forth. And and approach it from that direction. Excuse me. Or you can ask my lovely friend William to use Eduflow and play with other tools as well. So remember, no matter what, that even if a tool is listed on the job description, you need to be able to justify why it's being used. So if there's no reason, if the kind of training, for example, that a volunteer position would request of you would not involve storyline, or it wouldn't be conducive to the amount of time you have, then choose something else. And also that volunteer experience can be listed on your resume. So you would, like, if you're volunteering with somebody, even if it's to design one course for volunteers, put that on your resume. I hope that
Awesome. So helpful. And I think, just from our perspective at Eduflow, we have a bunch of courses that let you kind of design a course and do the storyboarding and that part of it. And that can be really helpful to have other people who are doing that same thing to kind of learn from and go through that. So I just put a link in the chat for Eduflow Academy. Eduflow you can use for free also. You can use up to 10, you can have up to 10 users, but when you're designing a course, you really just need you, and maybe you want to enroll as a test learner or something like that. And then we also shared a link to Genially. Genially is a course authoring tool as well. And they have a free plan, which is really great and helpful. So we definitely, in our experience, at least, William and I, we recommend those free tools. Don't spend a bunch of money on a tool just to be able to list it. You can always list on your resume authoring tool experience, that kind of thing. So we did have a bunch of other portfolio questions. So maybe in the future, we'll have to do another workshop specifically about portfolios. I don't know, just an idea. But thank you all for coming. And Laura, thank you so much. This was so helpful. Short, sweet, to the point session. We love that. If everyone wants to share their thank you in the chat or the reactions on Zoom to give Laura a round of applause, that would be
thank you.
So lovely. And Laura, do you have any promotional tidbits at the end that you want to share with us?
Well, I will say you can check out my website. I offer a few different services. I do resume writing and career coaching. Right now, I'm actually taking applicants for a learning and development specific course and program around like landing your first L&D job. It is limited to 10 participants though, but I will be running it again. And portfolios are a big piece of that, where we like take a deep dive into like how to maximize your time, how to know what to include, what to leave out, all of that fun stuff too. And sometime in the future, it may be offered by itself.
I love it. William, what do you have to share?
I just want to, Tara, give you a shout out for being such an awesome Q&A facilitator. I was trying to keep up with all the questions and I just couldn't. It was just, yeah. And I think the fact that it was so difficult for me to track all the questions means that we should also give a shout out to everyone who joined us for the session. The amount of energy and the interaction in the discussion has been incredibly amazing and very, very energizing. Thank you everyone so much for participating so much in this chat. Again, also Laura, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, and I will keep my fingers crossed that we can do a portfolio version of this workshop soon.
Sure.
And
sure. Thank you guys so much.
Awesome. And if you'd like to say goodbye before you head out, say thank you out loud. I've given you permission to unmute, and it's fun to hear everyone talk at the same time. So if you want to say goodbye before you head out, feel free, and have a great day.
Laura.
Bye,
Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Thank you.
May you get the job you want.
Yes, I love it. That's energy to have. I would love the portfolio version of this course. Good point. Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Yeah, I'm happy to do a portfolio one too.
Cool.
I feel like you can't talk about resumes without talking about portfolios, and you can't talk about portfolios without talking about resumes. So it totally makes sense.
Yeah, and the LinkedIn
Definitely.
presence too, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like that
Uh,
kind of falls to the wayside for a lot of people,
Mm,
because they're so focused on like their portfolio and things. But yeah,
Yeah,
or
and-
somebody's like so super LinkedIn and they think that that's key, which it is very helpful, but it's not the be all end all.
definitely. Yeah.
Thanks again so much, Laura. I think Tara and I we'll catch up on the LinkedIn chat, and then maybe start planning the next one.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Awesome. Have
Thanks,
a great
Laura.
day.
Bye.
Bye.